Welcome, everybody, to the CDEM webinar. It's a privilege to be here tonight. Speak to you, put together a great group of people to help out today. The idea from this came jointly between the CDEM board and the WestJEM people, just to help the educational scholars out there get their work out there and get published. So getting published in the Education Journal, specifically a little bit about WestJEM, but a lot of tools that will help you get published in any educational journal or article out there. I'm Douglas Ander, and I'll have everybody else introduce themselves. I'm at Emory University right now, one of the assistant deans for medical education. I've been the WestJEM education issue editor, well, co-editor for quite a while now, since its inception. Also sit on the WestJEM editorial board, and also on the side, also on the WAMC MedEd portal editorial board as an associate editor as well. So some experience in all this. The other Doug, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
All right, I'm Doug Franzen. I'm an associate program director and clerkship director at the University of Washington. I was actually part of the group that sort of got this whole thing off the ground back in the day. I was one of the CDEM representatives when we first started talking about doing this. So I've been on board since the very beginning too.
Wonderful. Jules?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jules Jung. I'm at Johns Hopkins in the Department of Emergency Medicine. And I was also around back in the day. I was a brand new member at large on the CDEM board when the whole WestJEM thing kicked off. So it's exciting to see how it's grown over the years.
Jeff?
Hi, I'm Jeff Love. I'm from Georgetown University, professor emeritus, and like the other four, I've been around since the beginning. I'm the core guest editor for the special issue.
Isabel.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Isabel. I'm the executive editorial director for WestJEM, and I assist Dr. Love, Dr. Ander, all the different editors with the kind of day-to-day basis of submissions to the journal.
All right. And Matthew.
Matthew Tews. I'm the Associate Dean and Campus Director for IU School of Medicine in West Lafayette, one of the regional campuses. I'm also, I think, an associate guest editor on this. And I was not around from the beginning, but thank you for, I'm in the presence of people who have been doing this for a while. So appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And thanks to our participants. And thanks to our CDEM staff for helping make this happen. Really appreciate it. Just sort of a quick agenda of what we're going to be trying to accomplish today during the webinar. Number one is just some information about the WestJEM education issue, what it takes sort of more on the logistics side to get published. We'll run through that. Then probably the heart of this is really pearls about success within educational scholarship. Finally, open time for questions, ideas that you want to bring to the group. Some of this is just going to depend on how much time that we have. I'll reiterate this later, but there's a lot of information. As we were putting this together, we realized that 45 minutes to an hour, just not enough time for all this. So consider this just to sort of be an introduction to educational scholarship as a whole. So the journal itself and the education issue. So the education issue was established in 2014. It's basically a partnership between WestJEM, the Council of Emergency Medicine Residency Directors, as well as the Clerkship Directors in Emergency Medicine. The goal is basically to promote quality education scholarship. It's got several key principles involved. Every educator is, as a necessary element of their responsibilities to be an academic faculty, should generate educational scholarship. I firmly believe, and when I mentor people, is that almost everything that you do within the educational realm, you can consider for educational scholarship, as long as it's done ahead of time, thinking about it ahead of time as you're putting together new and innovative programs. All right. All quality teaching is based on a scholarly approach that will naturally then lead to educational scholarship. And also, one of our main themes is to provide quality feedback to our authors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But regardless of the outcome of your submission, we want to provide the best feedback to our authors and also to our peer reviewers as well. And I'll spend a little bit more time on that later on. Just some statistics, just so you have a sense of how we've been doing. And this is just the last 2 years that I put up. 67 submissions in 2024 versus 40 in 23. So an increase there. You can see the breakdown there between 23 and 24 when it comes to CDEM submissions and course submissions. That's actually one of the reasons why we're here today, see what we can do to sort of bolster on the CDEM side. It's probably multifactorial about why there's a difference between the two. However, we want to make sure our CDEM members have the best chance of getting their scholarship out there. And you can see we've had a total of almost 1,000 submissions to date over the course of the years, and we've published 220 articles to date as well, and going strong. Just acceptance rates, it is, actually, I saw this today for the first time in a while and was reminded how competitive we are in our acceptance rates. Our goal is to obviously provide good feedback and get the scholarship out there, but we have a high standards of what we accept in the education issue. I'm going to try to run through this as sort of briefly as I can, but providing some details because we've got a variety of different types of submissions that can be put in. There's research, as we would think of as sort of more classical, sort of traditional research that can be original research or a brief research. And the only difference between that is really the number of words. Works that are more preliminary pilot sort of studies, narrow in scope, might be brief research versus original research would be longer, bigger sample size, wider scope, more generalizability to our readers. Then there's the educational advance innovation part of it, again, broken up into two parts. The longer version, which are structured reports of innovative programs or curriculum interventions that provide meaningful insights gained through implementation of those ideas, compared to brief educational advances or brief innovations that are typically preliminary findings, pilot projects, first-time projects. Typically, and none of this is sort of set in stone, the outcome measures for those are typically, and we'll go through this a little bit later when we talk about the pearls, at a lower level in a Kirkpatrick's, usually levels 1 and 2. Decisions about whether those are accepted, rejected, ask for revisions, a lot of times are based on the balance between your outcome measures and that degree of innovation. If it's highly innovative and we feel it should be out there in press, it might get accepted with a lower outcome level. So there's some variation on that. We've got two different types of review submissions that are possible, both narrative reviews and systematic reviews. And I put down, there are some references at the end, but we put down some references there for you to use on how those would be structured. Scholarly perspectives are basically perspectives that present a new and unique viewpoint on existing problems, fundamental concepts, prevalent notions on any specific topics, proposing a new hypothesis. It's basically an opportunity to focus on some current advances, future directions. So that's sort of what it entails. Almost like an editorial would be sort of another way to view this as far as what's going on out there, what's important for our readers to know about within emergency medicine and educational scholarship. So best practices, there's a little bit different. It's aimed at a specific area of educational practice, curriculum programming. Typically includes a review of any relevant literature. It's based on educational concepts. It can include insights from the authors based on their personal experience, but we want it backed up by good evidence as well. Generally requires some outcome data supporting the value of that initiative. So this is a little bit different from educational innovations, advancements. Best practices are initiatives with a sound basis and proven success that serves as exemplars that meet educational goals. So subtle differences between the two. If there's ever a question of where a submission might fit, that's a good time to reach out to either Jeff Love or myself or one of the other editors to figure out where the best place for your concepts might be. Sometimes we've had discussions before somebody's even written a full manuscript just to figure out what's the best place for this, if at all, within the education issue. So a little bit about costs. The great part about this relationship that we have between CDEM, Cord, and WestJEM is that if you get published in the education issue, there is no cost, all right? If you get published in the regular issue, there is an article processing fee. It's currently $1,250. Isabel, correct me. I see her shaking her head, so that's correct. So that's what the website said today. If your department has a subscription, if you're part of a sponsoring department, then it's free as well. There are some limitations as far as the number of accepted manuscripts per year for your organization. Details like that can be found, and I actually just put the link in there when you get the copy of the PowerPoint presentation. A little bit about the process that we go through when you submit a manuscript to WestJEM's educational special issue. It is a rolling submission process. That's something that's still relatively new the last couple of years, that we accept papers on a rolling basis throughout the years. Once they're accepted and they've gotten to the point of the final version, typically within about 2 weeks of the manuscript being finalized by all the copyright people, etc., that's when it'll get published online. During the course of the year, so starting in January of this year through the entire 12 months, as we accept, those are all collated in January of the following year. So this year it'll be January of 26 is when the special issue is then officially published. Deadline, just so you know, if you're thinking about anything that you want for the January 26 special issue, deadline for that is October 1st for submission. That way we have enough time to go through our peer review process with you to make that a reality. Sort of the flow of an article, once you hit the submit button and send it to us for review, is we have one of our consultant editors do a first review. They typically do that within a week or two, and they make a recommendation to the editors whether this is something that should move forward for peer review. We see that in other journals. What makes us different from other journals is if at that point we elect not to move it on to peer review, myself or Jeff Love, in the nice letter that we send back declining your submission, we typically provide a fair amount of feedback to you. I essentially, and I know Jeff does the same thing, essentially provides a full peer review of your work, explaining what can be done better next time to make it something that would move forward in the peer review process. We really stress the fact that we are not just a journal, but we're an educational venue as well for our authors. The peer review process then continues if you make it to that stage. We typically have 2 peer reviews at a minimum, sometimes 3. That's then followed by one of our associate editors reviewing it and providing their feedback, their input on what the final decision should be. The final decision is typically made in consultation between the editor and the associate editor. Obviously, the best one out there is accept. Typically, you're going to have some revisions. It would be a rare situation where there would be no revisions to a publication. The next one is revisions requested. Sometimes those are minor changes. Sometimes those are fairly major changes. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be accepted. Most of the time that's the case. However, it's not a guarantee. Sometimes, and I know I do this on my part, and Jeff Love can speak to his processes, sometimes we're slightly different, is sometimes I'll make a recommendation to somebody that if they put in for a educational advance, I may say, this is particularly innovative. I don't think your outcomes sort of get to that level of a full educational advance. Would you consider making this a brief educational advance? Get the publication, get your peer review article for your CV, you get your work out there. So it's an opportunity to still get published, get your work out there, but maybe not in the format that you initially envisioned. We've had some success with that. Obviously, reject is another possible decision. Anybody have any questions?
Doug, can I add something?
Oh yeah, please.
I think it's obvious, but it's worth stating that usually when it's a UME submission, it goes to the CDEM side, and when it's a GME, it goes to the Cord side. That's unless there's a conflict of interest. So, for instance, if I was an author on a manuscript, it would automatically be sent to the CDEM side because there's a conflict with me as an author. So just so you know how those play out.
All right, we are going to move on to pearls. All right. And this is the opportunity for us as a group, and we'll probably be sort of jumping back and forth between several presenters here. Initially, we called it pitfalls. I didn't want to call it pitfalls. I wanted to look at it like when you work on a SWOT analysis, what are the opportunities here, not the obstacles? So really viewing this of what are the opportunities out there. So what are the pearls of wisdom that we have with multiple years of experience doing this, so you can be really successful in your educational scholarship, not just for submitting to us, but it could be MedEd Portal, it could be one of the other education journals out there, even a non-EM journal as well. I can start off by saying that this is a busy graphic when it comes to different frameworks that you can use and how to conceptualize your scholarship and your work. It's available out there. The reference is at the bottom there. I know it is busy. It takes me about 10, 15 minutes every time I look at this to sort of digest what's in there, but it is a useful framework.
I think that it's really important to understand that your research question basically should frame the conceptual framework. So let me give you, for instance, if ABEM looks at the environment and says, listen, there's been a whole lot of changes in the environment around emergency medicine. Has it impacted the knowledge base of the people who are graduating from residency? The goal of that study is to see if it does. And so if they decide that their objective is to look at the written exams of graduates and see if the scores have changed over the years, that's the objective. And so that frames the whole study. Everything should be about, anything that's discussed in general should be framed by the conceptual framework of, does the environment seem to have an impact on the knowledge base of graduates? And our outcomes show this. And so all studies should have a conceptual framework, and it should basically be clear in your question that that's the case, and that drives your entire study.
So we put this one up in particular just so you had a sense of, and I know it's a busy slide, but I just wanted to highlight criteria for scholarship and what it should include. All right. A lot of people probably know this already, and I've seen it before, but it's something that needs to be considered anytime you've been thinking about putting together scholarship and a educational research idea. Number one, it needs to include clear goals. What is the purpose of the work that I'm going to be doing? Adequate preparation. Take your time. And this is sort of alluding to what I said earlier about any educational experience can be turned into scholarship, but that needs to be done with adequate preparation. You can't wait till the end of a workshop, to the end of a new curriculum and say, oh, we should go out and we should put this together and get it published. You won't have the right methodology, you won't have the right backgrounds, you won't have the IRB permission to do it as well. And if your IRB is like mine, they get very upset when I try to get retroactive, even if it's for an exempt study, they'll give me a hard time. So having that adequate preparation, really thinking long and hard about your methods and the methodology that you're using. Obviously, we all want significant results in the work. Effective presentation, yet making sure that whether it's a presentation in a national conference, whether it's the manuscript, that how you're presenting it is effective for the audience. And then some reflective critique as well. Within your study group, once you refined what you're doing as you're going through putting the study together, have an iterative process to make sure that you're doing the work appropriately. So a good sort of general sort of framework for how to put together educational scholarship.
So when it comes to educational interventions or curricula or programs, the general tendency when you first get out of residency, and Lord knows I'm guilty of this, is you see a gap in your environment and you get together with one or two other faculty members and you create something, pull out a literature or come together and say, we're going to do this and this to fill that gap. That in and of itself does not qualify as scholarship because it lacks the rigor that you would expect from something that you want other people to read and perhaps adopt. So that's the reason that when you have an intervention or a curricular or a program, in developing it, you should use a best practice. The most common best practice is Kern's 6 steps. Now, there's a whole bunch of them out there, but they're all very similar. By using Kern's 6 steps, you maximize your effort by a thoughtful and rigorous approach. So I want to quickly go through the 6 steps so you have some idea. The first step is the problem identification and general needs assessment. So that's usually done by the literature. There's usually literature out there that says, we need this, this is missing. And so when you do your literature review, you can actually paint a picture and therefore define the need assessment. Step 2 is if you've decided that it's a problem on a bigger scale, it's a targeted needs assessment for your learners and your environment, whether that's the faculty coming together and saying this is missing or a survey of your residents, whatever. But those aren't the only ways to do this. I'll give you, for instance, about 16 years ago, we wanted to start a program called Merkit Cord. And we went to the Cord board and said, we'd like to do this. And the Cord board said, we don't think there's a need for this. So we went home and sent out an email on the Cord listserv and said, who's interested in this program? And we got over 100 responses in very short order. And that included a number of leaders in the specialty. And all of a sudden, the Cord board said, sure, good idea, let's do this. But the point is, actually, that took care of step 1 and step 2 with just a simple question on a listserv. So there's a number of ways to get by both of those steps. This third one is to start with your goals and then move to objectives. And the objectives, as we said before, are the outcomes that you'll actually be presenting. So make sure that when you state your objectives, that's something you're going to be providing results for. Step 4 is educational strategies. And so when you're doing it, it's so common to get a submission where they say, oh, we put together this intervention and we've decided that we're going to give 6 lectures over this period of time. Well, it's a natural thing to do, but by doing a best practice, they say, basically, Kern says, sit down and think about what's the best way that they're going to learn what it is you want them to learn. So let's just say you're having problems with a lot of issues when it comes to complicated acute MIs, and you decide you want to have a series of sessions where people learn about issues that come up and how to deal with them. Well, you could do that by lecture, but you might stop and go, if what we did was broke this into small groups in a number of sessions, gave them a problem, had them work through it, then they would be engaged, not listening, and they'd learn from others. So in other words, it's important to sit down and say what strategies you think might actually make for the best learning experience. Step 5 is implementation. And if you think about it, and we see it frequently, they say we want to interject this into our curriculum. But the first question is, how do you fit that into a curriculum that's really busy? And the second thing is, what does it replace? So that's important in terms of knowing that up front. And you might consider the fact that there are resources involved. You got to figure out what the resources are you need and how you're going to get them, which may involve a reduction in time and it may cost money. And if that's the case, that means you got to get the leadership involved. So the implementation or things step is really important up front so your project doesn't fall short partway into it. The last step, 6, is evaluation and feedback. And so it's very important that you're evaluating the program and the learners as you go. And often these are the outcomes that you're trying to present in your study. And using that evaluation and feedback you get from the learners to improve the program for future iterations of your intervention. So that way, if you think about it, the best practice allows you to make one's initiative successful, scholarly, and therefore publishable. So it's important to consider this. The only other thing I point out is it's not uncommon to see a manuscript that says we followed the 6 steps of Kern's, and they show you number 1 and they show you number 2, and there's no evidence of 3, 4, or 5, or 6. When you do it, make sure you don't have to be explicit and say this is step 1 and this is step 2. It's pretty evident if you said we followed Kern's 6 steps as you go to tell whether you have or you have not. So that's all I've got to say about it.
I just wanted to chime in for a second. I was going to say almost the exact same thing, Jeff. And I feel like I see a lot of submissions that are probably step 4 or 5, right? An educational strategy or an implementation, but it's sold. The title of it is, hey, here's our curriculum. That's, wow, this really isn't a curriculum. It's probably more of an innovation, right? You came up with a new strategy for teaching this topic, or you implemented that in a different way. And that sort of goes back to what Doug was talking about, making sure that your submission fits neatly into one of those categories.
And the only other thing I'd
Thoughts?
add is I think it's the flow from start to finish when we look at, or at least the ones that I've looked at for the submissions, is there seems to be clarity at the beginning, but it doesn't resolve. Like the authors will say what they're trying to do, but then by the end, either they've come to a different conclusion or haven't done what they said they actually were going to do. And same with curricular development. If you be clear at very beginning about what you're trying to accomplish and make sure the reader's going to be able to understand you accomplished it. And I think that's one of the biggest disconnects I'll see is the aims don't match what is reported as the outcomes.
So I think Doug already kind of touched on this, but when I was thinking about how to contribute and what advice to give to authors about getting published, I kind of thought about like what are the things that are deal breakers for me as I'm reviewing as the associate editor. And lack of clarity in the conceptual framework is definitely a big one. And it's actually really common that like we're good at doing this in our jobs and even in our educational practice, but then when we sit down to write about it, we start getting distracted and going off on tangents. But it's really important that when you establish your research question, that there should be a clear match between the question you're asking, the methods you're using to solve it, the results you're getting, and ultimately what you're saying about them. And I think it's also really important to keep your humility hat on when you think about like what is the significance of these findings, because you may have findings that are meaningful, but we very often see like much broader conclusions drawn that are really supported by the evidence that's there in front of us. So that was just one piece of advice that I wanted to make sure, like, be really mindful of what your conclusions do and don't mean, and be mindful of your limitations. Like, nobody's going to think less of your work because you were honest about the limitations. Like, we cannot do methodologically perfect. There's a lot of factors that go into how people learn and things, and it's a challenging area. Another big one is to reach for the highest outcome that you can. So Doug alluded earlier to Kirkpatrick's hierarchy. I've also seen the translational research hierarchy used to describe educational research outcomes. But one of the most important things to remember is that the more robust your outcome, the more likely it is that your work is going to be publishable for pretty obvious reasons. And we get a lot of papers that are really at that they liked it kind of level of outcome, which in some areas, like if you have a really innovative way of teaching something, you're using a totally new teaching method. In some cases, the learner's perception of the value is all the outcome that you need. But if you're truly doing research, you probably really want to measure the extent to which the work that you did changed the learner's knowledge, their skills, ideally their actual medical practice in the real world if you can. It can be harder to get those higher level outcomes because education is really contaminated by a lot of things. Like I do most of my work in UME, and we obviously don't just turn med students loose in the ED and see whether or not their patients live. So we can't really measure things like patient outcomes or population health, but we can certainly measure surrogates of that when we evaluate their medical practice in the simulated setting or through other methods. So stretching yourself and going beyond the easy, low-hanging fruit outcome is another really good pro tip for getting your work published. Does anybody have comments about that or want to talk further?
The only thing I was going to say is that you shouldn't be embarrassed from the lower level outcomes as well, because according to Kirkpatrick, you can't have two without having one, and you can't have one without having zero. And so by all means, collect 0 and 1, but no, you need higher level outcomes in order to get published, generally speaking.
Especially to be published as research.
So now I will chime in because I think it
Okay.
also depends on what you're researching, right? If you are trying to come up with a new way of teaching something and you want to see, are my students more engaged, right? That's what the theory that I'm testing. Then level 1, like that's the perfect level, right?
Absolutely. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I threw this at Jules just because, although yes, it is wordy, I know that. I was trying to do two things at the same time.
Oh,
First,
good.
a presentation and the webinar, but also provide a reference for people. So they don't have to go out and search the literature or look at the reference. They can just look at the presentation if they just want one place to find Kirkpatrick. So that is out there for people to use. Your note about simulation, I think, is particularly important because having worked with students pretty much my entire career, it's really hard in your practice. We do some direct observation, but not much. Obviously, we don't let them loose in the ER with too much autonomy, except for the somewhat simpler cases. But in the simulation center, you can do a whole lot more. You can use simulated patients as well if it's communication skills. So there's definitely opportunities to work with your sim-based faculty if you've got that availability. So keep that in mind as a way to move up the hierarchy as well.
So this is kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about how sometimes lower level outcomes are good, but they may not be research per se. Now, Doug raised a very important exception, right? And as Jeff said, we need to have all of the above. So if we don't get our learners to sort of buy in to what we're trying to teach them, then obviously they're not going to learn well and they're not going to change their practice and it's not going to be impactful. So we do need all of it. And there may even be times when your research question is, do people spend more time? Are they more motivated? Are they, and a lot of those things are subjective. So I'm not by any means that like research is what we're supposed to be doing. That's what scholarship is. And there's a lot of dimensions of educational scholarship. So there's lots of different ways of sharing and presenting your work, and it doesn't all have to be proving that this thing is better than that thing, etc. So if what you have is a small pilot study with a small number of learners about a new way of doing things, and your outcome is that they enjoyed it and they found it valuable and they were more interested in learning in that way compared to the traditional way, then that's a great thing to put into an innovation or advance, and you don't have to try to contort it into being a research paper when it isn't. And similarly, sometimes we see these really long, elaborate manuscripts about relatively small problems or small interventions. That's what the brief format is for. And just because it's brief doesn't mean it's worse. It just means that it's more straightforward to describe and you can do it in fewer words. And definitely, I think people have hammered on this already, but using established best practices, like here I mentioned in writing reviews, but overall across the board, like structure your manuscript leveraging the existing sort of standards of care of education, and you'll be in a much better place than if you are writing it in a way that's more of a generic research paper, like IMRAD kind of style when it doesn't fit with that. All right, last thing of me on my soapbox, and then hopefully we can get some more discussion going. But another big thing is thinking about your comparators. And when you are engaging in research, you want to make sure that your comparisons make sense. Like the most common study type that I personally end up recommending that we reject is the people who compare teaching something to not teaching anything and are then delighted to discover that the learners that they taught learned things. And that sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but a lot of people on this call, myself included, early in our careers have written that paper. Like, I taught them things and then they learned the things, and this is great. So you want to make sure if you're trying to demonstrate that a particular method of teaching something is better than another method, that you are spending the same time and getting them to engage at the same level with the material. Otherwise, all you're doing is showing that smart people learn when you say things to them. And the same goes with like, we added this thing into our curriculum and suddenly everybody was better at it. Well, of course, if you add 4 hours into your curriculum that wasn't there before on a new topic, people are going to learn that new topic. You have to be mindful of comparing your intervention to something that is genuinely comparable to your intervention. And the last one is that you got to do your homework, right? So we see a decent number of education manuscripts where you're like, I'm going to prove that this method is better than this other method. Like there was a lot of that in the simulation literature early on. Like, I'm going to show that simulation works when we were like a decade into knowing, hey, simulation really works. So just be thoughtful if you're setting up a comparison that you are comparing apples to apples. Doug Franson, are you listening? Not apples to oranges, and definitely not apples to narwhals. All right. That's all I get.
There's some inside joke there that I'm not getting, but
For years on one of our med ed slides in a talk that Doug and I did for a long time, we had an apples to pineapples to narwhals comparison slide, so I couldn't
so,
resist.
sounds good. So actually, you said you were done, Jules, but actually this slide includes some content from you that I combined as well. So the top half came out of something that you sent me. So
I've been talking a lot, and it was really, I think, Jeff's input that made me start thinking about validity. So maybe Jeff would like to talk about this.
Jeff, you don't have to read the
Or maybe he
beginning
won't,
part
and
of
then
the
we can get
slide,
back.
but certainly the part validity, that the last sort of set of bullets is something that any of us can chime in on. But Jeff, if you want to give it a shot, otherwise I can.
But I do think there are a couple of things there that are really common, and people should know that it's important that you do that. So, for instance, in the 5 domains, when you say content validity, it's like, how did you go about doing it? Searching the literature, but also who was involved in the process. You need a couple of people who have a certain, at least experience, if not expertise, that come together. So often when one person does it, it's one person's opinion. When you make it a consensus and you follow consensus methodology, and there are a bunch of them out there, then what happens is what you come up with is much broader and more thought out. And so when you talk about putting together an initiative or putting together a curriculum, that content validity is based on who put it together and how they put it together, the whole process. It's pretty straightforward, but it's important to have, and we look for that when you're submitting any one of those manuscripts. Similarly, and that goes for surveys too. So when you're creating a survey, you really should have a group of people coming together and talking about what was the process, what was your resources, and what was their expertise to do it. The response process is very similar when you're talking about doing a questionnaire of people after a study, or you're doing a survey across the country. And that is, if you're going to do this, not only do you need content, but you need to know when people answer the questions that you sent out, did they interpret the questions the way you intended it? And so a very common thing to do is pick out a couple of people who have a similar background to your study group and have them take the quiz, the survey, whatever, and see how they do and what they have to say about it, whether they give you the answers you expect and whether they see some problems with it that they think should be corrected before it goes out to everybody else. So I think when we were talking about the importance of validity, those were the couple of things that I think are very straightforward and came to mind that come up all the time that I think it's important to understand when you're submitting a relatively straightforward study, but these need to be done.
The elements of validity that I put on the slide that Jeff was alluded to, the first couple, they're from a Downing article that breaks down the different types of validity. And I put them all up there. Not that you need all 5 of them in every paper you write, but if you're using any kind of assessment as your outcome measure, which of course is very common in educational research, you need to make sure you're measuring what you're trying to measure and looking at these domains closely and writing about how you came up with the content that was on your assessment and who vetted it and all the things that Jeff said, what they felt about it, how you collected the data, doing psychometric analysis of the data. Are the data reliable? Is there validity evidence within the assessment tool itself? The relation to other variables part, if everybody who fails the boards aces your exam and vice versa, then there's probably something wrong with your exam because the board has a big machine behind their operation and are generally producing pretty valid and reliable tests. So looking at any of these things that you can is going to help you make a better argument that the data that you're showing aren't just like, I put some questions on a piece of paper and these people answered them. That they actually mean something about the learning that took place in the activity.
So we're getting close to the end, and we're probably close to the end time here, but these are just some other pearls. Some of it is overlap with what we've spoken so far, and obviously if anybody else has anything else to add, please do. But number one, please follow submission guidelines. So this is true of any journal submission. You got to do your homework and read the submission guidelines and make sure that you're following our guidelines. Make sure you proofread it. Occasionally, I still get manuscripts that have track changes in it or still have the Microsoft Word underlying where something's misspelled. So please go through all of your manuscript references, tables. We talked about the literature search. Do your lit search. Occasionally a peer review will say, I found this other article. That's fine. That's great feedback. But sometimes they'll say this has already been done and give several references. That's almost going to be a denial in and of itself because of that lack of originality. Sample size, it's a challenge for all of us in educational research. There's no doubt getting adequate sample sizes. Look at it as an opportunity. Look at different departments, specialties within your institution that might be doing similar work. Engage other institutions, engage through CDEM, engage through the other group, the Educational Scholarship Group. Go to conferences and talk to people. You see somebody present a poster, go up to them, network. There are opportunities, right? I know it's difficult, but look for those opportunities, particularly within your own institution. I do a lot of interprofessional education work, so all my work now is done with physical therapy and physician assistant and nursing and public health. So consider what you have within your own environment. And then we spoke about some of the issues about clarity, coherence. We see a lot of that where the objectives, results, conclusions just don't naturally link together. So pay close attention to that. And sometimes people in the discussion conclusions completely are just not supported by either the data or the methods. So be cognizant of that when you're looking at your own work. Any other particular pearls from our presenters?
Regarding the comment on sample size, it is a little difficult, I think, to find people at other institutions. But I'll say, I mean, we had, 80 people sign up for this. Right? Everybody's interested in publishing. We're all facing the same educational problems. I think it's rare that everybody on this call would have their own unique educational problem only at their institution that none of the rest of us on this call are facing right now. Right? So reach out to friends and people at other schools, cold email folks, hey, I'm interested in working on this problem, put a post on the CDEM list, or you'll be shocked. And that's how many of my group projects got off the ground, was just like, hey, I'm wrestling with this thing. Has anybody else wrestled with this? And then either somebody sends me an answer or they say, no, I don't know how to do that, but I would love to help. Sign me up, right? And then next thing you know, you got 4 or 5 institutions, your N goes from 14 to 100, and life just gets a whole lot easier. And you got a lot of creative minds working on solving a problem. So don't be afraid to reach out and say, I'm trying to tackle this problem. You'll be surprised how many people want to help.
Doug, I'd like to reinforce your first 2 pearls because I think they're really important. It's easy to list that. I see it all the time. But if you're a submitter, I understand. You did all that work on that study and you got it done and you want to get it in. And taking a lot of time to make sure it's perfect is not high on the list. And I think that's human nature. But understand that the process is as objective as we try to be in decision making. It is partially subjective. And so if you get a manuscript that's got a lot of mistakes in it, they go over the word limit, and they make a lot of issues, that's a negative slant for us. That's not a reason to reject. But if there's some question about your manuscript in the first place and it has all these mistakes in it, I can promise you it doesn't ensure, but it makes it more likely that it gets rejected just because it gives us a negative feel for, if you did this with the submission, what did you do when it came to the work that you were doing on this study? If you were on this side of the equation, I have no doubt you would see it the same way we do.
Yeah, along those lines, I think if you submit something that's closer to your final draft and not just something with track changes that you haven't finalized, as Jeff said, I think you're going to get better feedback. So if you really put the effort into it, and on our end, we're reading it, and it's like, this is actually pretty well done. That maybe there's a major error, some minor errors. I think that helps you get more directed feedback. So I think if you're just throwing it at the wall to see if it will stick, that's not a good mentality for submitting to any journal, especially one where you have your colleagues who understand the issues that are going on and the topics you're addressing. And so we want to help you be successful. And we do want the studies and the dissemination of stuff that will help other people in our specialty too.
If anybody has any questions, go ahead and certainly add in the chat or just unmute. I put down our email addresses and the WestJEM email addresses. Feel free to reach out. Doug, Jules, Matthew, I didn't put your email addresses on there. I wanted to kind of protect you guys, but feel free if you want to, you can put them into the chat. And the other thing is, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't make a call for reviewers. We're always looking for good peer reviewers. It is a great way to learn about educational scholarship. As you read through other people's work, first you get some great ideas. Like you read something and go, oh, wow, that's a great idea. You might network with that person later on. We typically will send back our decisions with the other peer reviews, the editorial comments, etc. So that's a learning opportunity. I know even when I do reviews for academic medicine, when they send me back the final decision, I make sure I read through this. Why was it accepted? Why was it rejected? Why did they ask for revisions? What did they put in their comments? So very useful. If you're junior, and you've never done one before, just reach out to us. We'll work you through the process of doing this. The only way to do it, kind of like ultrasound, after a while, you can't just watch people do it. You just got to put your hands on the probe and do it. Same thing with peer review. You just got to do it at one point. So please reach out to us. We put down a series of references that are in there as well. It's not meant to be all comprehensive list of references. I did my best to sort of put them within some categories, but these are some of the articles that we use on a regular basis. So it's a good reference source as you're trying to work through your scholarship. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions from the group, I'll look at the chat one more time. Doug put in that I'm working with a fourth year medical student who's getting her first paper ready to submit. So yeah, a lot of mentorship opportunities as well as you progress through this. So keep that in mind as well. The other place is to get involved with committees. A lot of my papers came through committees, working groups at a national level and regional level. So keep that in mind as well. I'm assuming SAEM is always looking for people on their committees. And with that, I will call it a night. I know it's evening and nighttime for many of us, depending on what coast you're on. Thank you to presenters. Thanks to CDEM and CDEM board. I really appreciate it. Isabel, thank you for all the work that you do on the WestJEM side to make our life easier. Julianna, thank you for getting this all together. And have a good night, everybody.